Jerry, after reading your book, I thought about asking someone I've been studying with to write down what evidence would convince them that God exists. I believe, to be fair, I should write down what would shake my faith in his existence. I was wondering what you would say. I have an idea, but wanted to know what you thought. Welcome to the Faith Science Podcast, episode 38. I'm your host, Jerry Swafford, and on this podcast, we explore the integration of science with faith. Today, we're going to answer that question. What would it take for me to leave the faith? I end each podcast by saying, keep asking questions and keep the faith. This podcast is about helping people who are believers to continue in their faith and challenging people who are atheists to really think deeply about why it is you don't believe and to present evidence, to present arguments in favor of the existence of God. And so, one of the things that I was asked this past week was about what it would take for me to leave the faith. What evidence, what argument might someone make that would help, that would basically take me away from believing in God? And so, when the book there is mentioned, it's referring to my book, I Walk Therefore I Am: How Walking on Two Legs Proves That God Exists. That book came out last year, and if you're interested in the book, it's available on Amazon, um, also Barnes and Noble, places like that where books are sold online. Um, if you want the ebook version, if you just send me an email at jerry@jerryswafford.com, I'll send you a link to the book. And so it's spelling that is JERRY at JERRYSWEAFFORD.com. And I'll send you a link to the book, and you'd have a copy of what I'm showing you on the screen here if you're watching on YouTube. And so, one of the elders of the congregation I'm a member of, he asked me this question this week. He sent me an email and said, "Hey, I'm studying with somebody, and I'm curious to be able to kind of use an approach that you used in the book. So I want to show you that really quickly. It comes from chapter 7 in the book. Does faith in God require extraordinary evidence?" And so I'd like to be able to get there faster than just scrolling. So if we go to, let's say, page, I don't know, page 100, that's chapter 5. Page 120 is chapter 6. Okay. So, does faith in God require extraordinary evidence? I begin that chapter with a quote from Carl Sagan, who is the person that is most well known for basically making this claim that atheists like to quote, which is extraordinary claims that require extraordinary evidence. Now, people often make that that claim, or they make that quote or that assertion, and then I seldom see people that are actually willing to follow through on that, because the idea seems to be something like, well, if you believe in some uh, old man in the sky that made everything, that's a really extraordinary claim. So you better have some extraordinary evidence. And so part of what we're going to point out today is that believing in a God that created everything is far closer to something that makes more sense, and it is far less extraordinary than the claim that mindlessness and randomness and a lack of purpose came up with things that have order, design, and purpose. So what you're going to find is that is an extraordinary claim that the atheist and the evolutionist makes. That if you're going to follow this logic, you would say that requires extraordinary evidence. And generally, not only is there not extraordinary evidence, it's quite underwhelming when you look at the evidence that is made in favor of this. So, in that chapter, what I ask agnostics and atheists to do is to actually look for what would constitute reasonable evidence for the existence of God. People say, well, you need to have extraordinary evidence. That's what would be reasonable. But that's just not true in reality. When we think about things that are extraordinary, so extraordinary claims, one of the arguments I make in the book is that when you think about the fact that there are all kinds of extraordinary claims, things that are out of the ordinary that we believe do happen, have happened, and we don't require extraordinary evidence for them. We require a reasonable amount of evidence that would cause us to believe. And so this idea that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence is just not true in your everyday life. There are things that happen that are out of the ordinary that you believe happen and have happened, and you don't require some kind of supernatural evidence for it. You just understand, okay, I have the preponderance of evidence points to this. And so the question we ask in this chapter and in general is, what would constitute reasonable evidence for you to believe in the existence of God? So the atheist essentially says, I haven't seen reasonable evidence to cause me to believe in God. Fair enough. What would reasonable evidence look like? Now, often I've found that when asking this question, no answer is given. Or sometimes atheists haven't even thought about what that would look like to come across evidence that would convince them of God. What would it look like? Does God need to write his name in the stars? Does it need to be some kind of supernatural evidence, as this quote from Carl Sagan seems to suggest? What is it? You really need to come up with that beforehand, rather than just basically dismissing all of the evidence and saying there isn't anything that could convince me, right? So what sometimes happens is you'll see in interviews with atheists that you'll have someone say, "Okay, so what would be something that would convince you?" And sometimes you'll literally have atheists that are debating about these things say, "Well, there isn't really anything, because if I gave you a thing, I would assume that I was hallucinating if I came across that evidence." Now, if you think about that for a second, if there isn't any evidence that you could look at, if there isn't anything that you could observe and say, wow, there must be a God based on this, then you already are basically painting yourself into a corner. You are already conceding that I'm just going to believe this and it doesn't matter what the evidence says. Now, think about that for a second. If you're saying, I don't care what the evidence is, I'm going to not believe it, I will refuse to believe in God, then that's not that's not a scientific perspective for sure. And yet that is commonly what people will say. That I just, when it really comes down to it, I just really don't want to believe. And if that's where you are, then it'd probably be a good idea to just stop watching this video moving forward, because it's just going to frustrate you. You already don't want to believe. And so, and you will refuse to believe no matter what the evidence is. But if you are someone who says, no, I will look at what the evidence says, I will go in the direction of what I see, then by all means continue to watch, because part of what I'm going to do is I'm going to put myself in your shoes and ask the question, well, what would I need to see that would break my faith, that would tear down my faith? And what's really cool about that is, if you as an atheist say, okay, Jerry's giving me the blueprint to deconstruct his faith, and I'm going to give you the blueprint. You find this and be able to show this in the world, you have the keys to deconstruct my faith for sure, and I would say the faith of many others. And so we're going to talk about what that is in a few moments. But my point is, if you're an atheist, then you really need to do this, because the thing about atheism that's really interesting is that it is basically an impossibility to prove a negative. And where I talk about this in the book, but for example, if you were to set out to prove that unicorns do not exist, because you are not capable of knowing everything and being in every place, it is quite possible that a unicorn exists somewhere in this world or in this universe that you are not privy to, that you're not able to know. So the idea of proving the non-existence of something is logically an impossibility for you. You can't prove it because you can't be in every place. So when the atheist does this, you are doing this, you're making a claim that you couldn't possibly prove. Now, what you could do, and I think that's what some people go in the direction of, is that they will say, well, if you say that the God that you serve is like this, and I can show a contradiction, then that God must not exist. And that's a logically more tenable approach. But often what happens is that the atheist can often say, no, no God of any kind exists. And I'm sure of this. And I want to try to convince others of this. And just again, in general, you cannot do this because unless you're in every place to be able to see whether a God exists in every place, you couldn't possibly know this. So the question we're asking here is, let's say God does exist. We would assume that there is some evidence of this. What kind of evidence would be reasonable for you to say, I've seen enough? There must be a God somewhere. And so, what I do in this is talk about the idea that extraordinary claims do not require extraordinary evidence. And I simply point out one of the most extraordinary claims of our lifetime, which is the entire COVID debacle. There's never been anything like that. To call it extraordinary is an understatement. But imagine that you were someone who went into a coma in 2019 and you woke up in 2024 or 2025 and people began to explain to you what happened during this time that we can call the COVID years, beginning in 2020, and what happened in the world and some of the continuing repercussions of this. If you were someone who was living in the world prior to 2020 and you did not experience COVID, the claims that we would be telling you about are absolutely extraordinary. And yet, we would expect you to believe what we were telling you, and we wouldn't be giving you extraordinary evidence. The evidence we'd be giving you would be actually quite ordinary. We'd be giving you eyewitness testimony. We would be giving you videos. We would be giving you documents. And we would expect that enough people would show you enough evidence and there would be enough agreement on the evidence that you finally say, I was in a coma during the time, but this thing called COVID really did happen. And so, what I show here in this AI generated image in the book is that you could imagine that Carl Sagan, who died before 2019, if he was somehow during his lifetime stepping into a time machine going into the future, let's say 2024 when I finish the book, you could imagine him saying, well, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And you have people wearing masks all around the world talking about this thing called COVID, which is based on a coronavirus, which is, coronaviruses are basically where most common colds come from. And if you were trying to explain to him what happened in the world, you'd be making a series of extraordinary claims. And if he truly believed that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and all we were going to do is tell him that it happened, give eyewitness testimony, videos, and documents, guess what? That's all ordinary evidence. He might well, if he truly believed this, step back into his time machine and essentially say, hey, these people in the future, they claim that there was something called COVID, making all these people wear face masks, but I don't believe that because I need to see extraordinary evidence of this. And of course, extraordinary evidence in the sense that the atheist is often, the kind of evidence that the atheist is often claiming they want would not exist in the case of this. So this is true for any extraordinary claim. Like, for example, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That'll be something that we could spend a podcast or a series of podcasts on, the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Guess what? It's not going to be something extraordinary where, let's say, Jesus actually appears to you and that's what's going to be necessary for you to believe. No, it's going to be quite ordinary. Eyewitness testimony. There are going to be documents. There's going to be the existence of many people that saw him and the claims that are regarding all of this. The fact that there are prophecies that can point to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And we see that other aspects of his life came true during his lifetime. So that's the resurrection. That's one of the most extraordinary claims in Christianity. And there's evidence behind it. But the evidence is not some kind of extraordinary thing, but we never require extraordinary evidence for the extraordinary claims that we believe. So, what do we require? The answer is we require what I'm going to call reasonable evidence. And what I mean by reasonable is that if I reason with the evidence that I see, that it would make more sense that the extraordinary claim were true than for it to not be true. That's how we actually do things. That if Carl Sagan stepped out of a time machine, we would expect that we would give him enough reasonable but quite ordinary evidence that he'd eventually say, okay, I guess that thing called COVID really did happen. That's why all these people wear these face masks. It's really weird. It's certainly extraordinary, but there is enough ordinary evidence that I can reasonably conclude that that is what happened. This is what happens with the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So if you're an atheist and you're saying, I want some extraordinary evidence, you don't claim that about anything. There are all kinds of extraordinary things that happen, and you don't require extraordinary evidence. What you require is reasonable evidence. And so that's what we are talking about here. And so if we go back to the initial question that was asked to me this past week, where I was asked, well, what what evidence would you give that would shake your faith in the existence of God? I want to show you my answer, and we'll talk through what my answer is when it comes to that, and we'll show how it really, again, points to it gives the challenge. It really puts the challenge on the atheist in this case, because what the atheist believes is the opposite of what we see in reality, and that's one of the things I'm going to show. And so what I would say is, hey, if you could show that what I'm saying doesn't represent reality, then that would completely shake my faith in God. It would shake my faith in what I thought reality was. But what I'm going to show you is that the way reality works, we all understand these things to be true. The issue is that the atheist doesn't make the application to belief in God, and that the believer does. So, what would it take for me to have my faith shaken, for me to deconstruct from belief in Jesus Christ? And let me get more specific here, be more precise with my language. I'm talking about not even about Jesus Christ. As we've talked about several times over the course of this podcast, classical apologetics can be somewhat divided into three parts. The first is a discussion of the existence of God. Does God exist? The second is a discussion of the inspiration of the Bible. Is the Bible the inspired word of God? And then the third is the deity of Jesus Christ. Is Jesus Christ the Son of God? So you can kind of think of it in terms of those three questions. Now, in my estimation, those build on each other. You begin with the existence of God. Then you build on top of it with the inspiration of the Bible, and you end with the deity of Christ, which really hinges heavily on the resurrection. With this question, we're really not talking about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We're not talking about the inspiration of the Bible even. What we're talking about here specifically is, does God exist? And what would it take for me to look out at the world, at my existence, and say, if this were true, if I saw this evidence, it would tear down my faith that there is a God. Because faith in a creator, faith in a designer of the world, faith in God really is something that you must have before you can even talk about, does God have a book like the Bible? It's before you can talk about Jesus Christ being the Son of God, you have to begin with the foundation of, does God exist or not? So that's why we're not really discussing scripture today. We're not discussing Jesus Christ explicitly today. We're talking about fundamentally, is there a God or gods? Is there deity of some kind or not? And what would it take to shake my faith that that is something that is true? Well, my answer was, I began by saying that's a great question because nobody's really asked me that. And in the book, I'm certainly asking atheists to make that leap of, okay, put yourself in the place of, okay, I don't know whether God exists or not. What would I need? What evidence would I need to see that would shift me from being atheistic or agnostic to being theistic? What would I need to see? And like I said before, this is often something that people don't do because it's difficult and it's causing you to literally think the opposite of the way you would normally think. So, my answer was, for me, a lack of order in the world would shake my faith in God's existence. If a close examination of reality on all levels, from the macro to the micro, revealed no structure, no patterns, and no systems, if chaos consistently produced order without intention, then there would be no need for belief in a designer. Now, I'll go on with the rest of my response later, but let me start with that first idea. What I would need to see that would fundamentally shake my faith in God. And so if you're an atheist, you're taking notes and you're saying, I'm out to deconstruct Jerry's faith. Okay, let me give you the key. What you need to show is a lack of order in the world. And I'm going to talk about more about what that means as we proceed. But you need to show a lack of order in the world. And so to kind of dig more deeply here, what I'm saying is what my contention is. Let me tell you what my contention is, and let me tell you what the evidence would need to be to reverse that. My understanding of the world, I'm a mechanical engineer, I'm a robotics engineer. My understanding of the world is that it is orderly. When you look at the planets, and we call it a solar system, we see structure, we see systems, we see patterns. We see this in the human body, of course. This is what I wrote the book about. We see structure, order, systems, patterns in the world everywhere, no matter how closely you examine things. If you want to take a microscope and look as small as you could possibly look to the micro, you'll find it. You'll find patterns, systems, order. If you zoom out and look macro, look on the order of planets, look on the order of large stars, what you see is order, what you see is patterns, what you see is systems, what you see is structure. The thing that would shake my faith is if I looked out at the world and I looked to the macro, really big, and I looked to the tiny, the micro, and what I saw was no order. If what I looked at was there is no order, there are no patterns, there are no systems, there are no structures. If what I saw on top of that is, let's say there was order that I saw, but what I saw consistently is that order was produced from chaos, from randomness, from a lack of purpose. That if from nothing you saw things pop into existence, if from a lack of purpose, a lack of systems, a lack of structures, a lack of patterns, you saw patterns emerge and structures emerge and systems emerge, designs emerge. If that's what we saw in the world, that would break my faith. Now, of course, that isn't what we see in the world, and we'll get to that in a second. But I want to be clear on what you would need to show. If you're taking notes and you're going to do your homework and you're going to say, hey, because at the end I'm going to give you some homework. If you're an atheist and you're wanting to deconstruct my faith, let me explain to you how to do it. What you're going to need to do is, first of all, show that there is no order, show that there is no structure, patterns, systems, intention, design of any kind. That's what you need to show. But on top of that, let's say you can't show that, because my contention is that you cannot. But let's say you can show that order exists, structure exists, patterns exist, systems exist, designs exist. Here's the second approach that you could take. Show that those things emerge from a lack of those things. Show, or a lack of intention, let's say. So a lack of deliberation, a lack of thinking, a lack of thought, of direction, of aim. Show that those things arise without that. That would be the other thing. So, for example, if we saw things pop into existence from nothing, if we saw randomness produce order, if we saw a lack of structure produce structure. If we saw a lack of intention or purpose produce designs, if you can show that, then that would be the second thing. So first of all, show me that none of those things exist. It's kind of hard to do. We have words for those things because they exist. But beyond that, let's concede that they do exist. The second approach that you could take is to show me that those things come about randomly, on their own, no intention, no purpose. That would be the other way. Because if you can show that, then as I say here, there's no need for a designer. The entire argument from the design inference perspective is to say, we see those things. We see designs. We see systems. We see patterns. We see structures. And in our experience, my experience as an engineer, you don't see systems without systems designers. You don't see structures without structural designers. You don't see these patterns without someone making the pattern. They don't just arise from nothing. Now that's my uniform experience. That is my repeated experience. That's what I see repeatedly. Now, let's say I'm just wrong about that, and the evidence is presented to me that, actually, Jerry, there are all kinds of things that pop into existence from nothing. There are all kinds of designs that have no intention behind them. There are all kinds of systems and patterns and structures that come about from random processes. Now, again, to even call something a random process is almost an oxymoron. So from randomness, let's say, because if something is a process, it's not random, right? So you can't have it. You can't have it both ways. It's the problem I have with Darwin. He introduced this term called natural selection. But the fact that you're talking about selection and you're saying that nature selects, you're literally applying the intention behind nature, because clearly we see intention. And to make it make sense, what Darwin did is he kind of personified Mother Nature, you might say, and he calls it natural selection. But nature doesn't select anything because there's no person there. People select things. Nature doesn't select, but you have to personify to make it make sense. I hear people say all the time, the human body was designed to do this. We were designed to do that. And I'm like, yes, I agree. People who are atheists will say that. And I go, I agree with you. Yes. But they don't really believe it was designed. They believe it came out of chaos. They believe it came from nothing, ultimately. And so, my challenge to you, and we'll come back to that at the end of the pod today, but my challenge to those of you who are atheists, show that order and systems and patterns don't exist, right? And if you can't do that, then show that those that do exist come about without intention, without design, without intention, or without intentionality, without deliberation. That's what you would need to show. And if you can show that, it would absolutely destroy my faith. It would absolutely deconstruct my faith, because then there is no need for a God. But if I'm right about the nature of reality, that these things exist, every time we see them, there is a mind behind systems and patterns and structures and designs and purposes. If every time we see those things, there's a mind behind it, then when we see them in nature even, then there must be a mind behind it. That's the design inference. So what you would need to do to reverse that or to negate that is to show, well, actually, you don't need that. And that's essentially what evolutionists say. They essentially say, well, no, it can just randomly happen. But they're only saying that because people come up with these, they do these things where, like Darwin did, where you personify nature, right? And you speak of nature as the blind watchmaker, as Dawkins did, Richard Dawkins. But nature isn't a person. So to call it natural selection, you're using terminology of design, but nature isn't designing anything. What you're essentially saying is that there is no design. There is no. It's all random. But no one would go along with it because it doesn't make any sense. It's incoherent. It doesn't. It's an untenable position to say that there isn't a progression, and to say that things go from chaos to order, which is not what we see. It is a reversal of the second law of thermodynamics. That doesn't make sense. So that's what you would need to show. Now I go on to take this not just from a design perspective, but let's think about the moral aspect to this as well. If morality had no true merit, if evil always led to fulfillment and goodness was consistently fruitless, then it would be difficult to sustain the idea of a God of purpose and righteousness. What I'm doing here is taking it from the, let's say, scientific realm to more of a moral, ethical, religious realm. That one of the things we see in the world is that these ideas that we're talking about from a physics perspective, let's say, or from a biology perspective, these ideas are also true in the realm of morality and ethics and reason. One of the things you could show me, we've already talked about two. Let me give you a third. Let me recap the first two, and then I'll show you what the third one is related to morality. The first one is, show me that there is no order in the world. Show me that we live in a world with no structures, no patterns, no systems. I mean, it's easy to show that, of course, all of those things exist, or we wouldn't have words for them. So the second thing that you could do, since the first one's kind of an impossibility almost at the outset, the second thing you would need to do is you need to show that those things do exist, but they come into existence without intention or design or purpose. Frankly, without a mind. Now, my contention is you never find those things without a mind. The atheist or the evolutionist contention is that they did come into existence without a mind. Now, my contention is, well, show me. Now, you're just going to say, well, yeah, all of that stuff came without a mind, and you're just going to claim it. But again, we see purpose there. We see structures. We see systems. Now, you show me where a system arises without designers being present, without designers making that come to pass. And then I could concede, oh, okay, well, then there's no need for a God there. But here's the third thing. If you can show that there is no merit to morality, right? We've been talking from a physics perspective, but let's talk on an ethical or moral perspective. You know, if it's truly survival of the fittest, if that's really true, then as humans, if I can just do what I want to, might makes right, then if I want to kill you, I can kill you. If I want to lie to you and get away with it, I'll lie to you. I'll do what's possible, or I do what makes sense for me without any regard to morality. Now, I think this is a place where I'm not saying that atheists are inherently immoral people, but I don't know how you advocate for atheism without also advocating for amorality. Now, when I say amorality, I don't mean immorality. Immorality means bad morals. Amorality means no morals. If you believe that we're all coming from amoebas, if you believe that we're all just basically glorified bacteria, then you don't really have a sense of why something would be right or wrong, like killing being wrong, or lying being wrong, or stealing being wrong. From an atheistic perspective, you really have no transcendent reason to say that one thing is right or another thing is wrong. And this is one of the things I think that's interesting, because I find many people who are atheistic to be quite moral. But my question is always very simple. Where'd you get it from? Because you can't say, well, that lions are moral. If a lion wants to kill another lion, or a lion wants to kill whatever it wants to kill, it just does it. And it doesn't think about it. This is something that's an inherently human thing. So if you think we came from animals, you have to really deal with the question of where'd that morality come from? And essentially, what an atheist will generally say is things are just better for us when we act in an ethical or a moral way. And so the third thing I would say is I agree with that. The thing that would cause me to question God would be if that weren't true. I find that many atheists actually agree with me. They agree with that morality has merit. Being evil is not something that's going to lead to fulfillment. Being a good person isn't something that, nice guy, they say nice guys finish last. But is that really true? Answer is, well, no. If we really believe that, then we would all try to be as evil as possible and do what we could to be evil so that it would be better for us. But the way the world works is not that way. Now you will say to me, well, that's just the way the world works. People will say things like, well, the universe causes things to be that way. No. A system works the way it works because the designer made it that way. Things work better for you when you're a moral person because that's the way God made the world. So this idea that we just kind of came up with these morals over time, we were animals, and then we came up with morals to make things better for us. It doesn't make sense. That is a system of morality. And we see in the world that things go better for you when you are a good person, when you are a moral person, when you are an ethical person. You become more fruitful. You become more fulfilled. It's not that when you're more evil, you become that way. And so for me, the third thing would be, if I looked out at the world and evil and immorality and being a bad person actually was better for you, it would cause me to question, is there really a God who is righteous? Is there really a God of purpose? Is there someone who has created a transcendent standard of morality? Because if everywhere you look, doing things that would be considered bad actually are better for you, why not do that? Again, that's not how we view things. And I would argue, I don't think that there are atheists that really think that. I find them to borrow quite a few morals from God, but just not want to give him the credit for them. So let me give you the last part of my answer, and we've already been talking about it. And so the last part of my answer, after basically giving those three things. So number one, if I'm looking for three pieces of evidence that would cause me to deconstruct my faith, the first one would be, show me that there's no order. Show me that there are no patterns or structures. Well, we have words for those things, so they clearly exist. But number two, I would say, okay, if you want me to deconstruct from my faith, show me that the rise of order and structure and patterns and designs comes from a lack of intention, comes from randomness. Show that. Now, that's really tough to do because that's not what we see in the world. We generally see minds, and I don't even want to say generally, we universally see a mind give rise to a design. We see intention give rise to things that are made with purpose and effectiveness. Things that work effectively don't just happen that way. And I say this as someone trained in engineering design. It's just not how it works. And so I see a lot of biologist types like Dawkins and some of these other guys that claim things like that don't have to design anything. You don't come up with good designs. You don't come up with effective designs and systems without someone thinking about it. And they can keep telling you that that's what happens, but it isn't what happens. And so it's fine for Dawkins, who doesn't design anything, to call nature the blind watchmaker. But he doesn't design things. So he can't tell you that you can have effective designs without a designer? He wouldn't know because that's not what he does. And so this is what I would be looking at. What we see is the opposite in nature and in the world and in the universe. We see order, we see structure and purpose woven into the fabric of existence. It doesn't matter how small you look or how big you look. You look at physics, you look at human nature. What we see is order, structure, and purpose everywhere we look. Now, the question is, how did that get here? Well, we generally see that order, structure, and purpose come from intentionality, come from energy, come from thought. And so the fact that we can learn, predict, and rely on the consistency of the world speaks to design. It would be one thing if we were out here and you couldn't really predict what was going to happen. If I plant a seed, is a tree going to grow or a bush going to grow or grass going to grow? No, we know that if you plant a certain type of seed, it is going to yield a certain type of plant. And we can know that with consistency. There's no randomness to it, that you plant a seed and you don't know what's going to happen. If you have a man and a woman that come together, they marry, they have children, it's always funny when people say, "Oh, that kid looks just like his mother," or she looks just like her father, or whatever the case may be. And it was funny. I was having lunch with a family that I worship with, and we were looking at a yearbook, and one of the kids' picture was compared to a picture of their dad when he was at the same age, and they said, "Oh man, they look just alike." And I wasn't meaning to be funny. I was just like, "Yeah, but that's genetics." Right? Like it's genetics. We can consistently see that a child looks like their parent, and we sometimes marvel at this and act like we're shocked, but that's how it works. We see all kinds of things like that in the world, that when we do certain things, we get certain outcomes. The fact that we can have that kind of consistency is design. We are, as humans, designed a certain way. There's a certain way to do things, and there's a certain way that's going to make things harder for you in the world. And that's not just true from a physics perspective, but that's true from a human nature, ethics, and morality perspective. So the fact that we can look at morality and that lines up, when we can look at physics and that lines up, when we look at human nature and it lines up, all of these things come into place. It further reinforces this. In my estimation, these realities make the existence of God an undeniable position. How else do you explain these things being true from a moral perspective, these things being true from a physics perspective? No matter how largely you look, no matter how small you look, it's true. How do you explain that? Oh, it just happened to be that way? It just so happened that we were designed this way. But show me a design without a mind. Just one. Show me one design that didn't have a mind behind it. Now, what you might do is you might go to nature and look at something and show that it's designed, and then you might claim that it has no mind behind it. But I'm talking about, show me structure, purpose that has no intention behind it. That's what you would need to do to convince me and many others that there is no God. So if you're an atheist and you're watching this or you're listening to this, here's your homework. Here's my challenge. I don't need many. I wrote my book and I just focused on one example of this. So I'm not asking for many. I'm asking you to find one example of order, structure, and purpose coming without intention from chaos, randomness, and a lack of purpose. Show me chaos giving birth to order. Show me randomness producing structure. Show me a lack of purpose and a design coming out of that. Please, if you can show that first of all, it would obviously be an exception to the rule that I've just claimed. My contention is it never happens. This is a universal law. But let's say you could show that. Then here's your extra credit. Maybe you can find one example of this. I don't think you can, but let's say you can find one example. What you would then need to do in order to overturn my faith is not just have that one example. That's an extraordinary case. But you would then need to be able to show that order arising from chaos and all of the other things as well. Structure arising from randomness, purpose coming from a lack of purpose. You would need to show that those things happen regularly as a rule, and that it is the prevailing pattern in all of nature and the world. Now, if you can show that, then I'll tell you, my faith is in jeopardy. I'm in a bad position. But my thing that I would tell you next is, let's say you start looking. You can't find one. You can't even find one example. And I don't mean you claiming it to be an example. I mean, find a real example of order, structure, purpose, and show how that would come into being from chaos, randomness, and a lack of purpose. Just one. If you can't find even one example, then it seems to me that ought to shake your faith in atheism. Because as we always point out, everybody believes in something. And if you believe in atheism, you believe that there is no God. That is a belief system. It ought to shake your faith that you don't see anything, you don't see any time in the world that chaos, randomness, and a lack of purpose give birth randomly, again, with no intention behind it, to order and structure and purpose. I would say to you that what I'm really asking you to do is reverse the second law of thermodynamics. So there's a reason we call it a law. I'm asking you to find me an example that negates the second law of thermodynamics. Show me chaos not arising, to give you a sense of what the second law of thermodynamics is. It basically says that the world, the universe, tends towards disorder. If you have order and you have structure and you have purpose, what tends to happen in the world is that things get more disorderly. They get more chaotic. They don't go in the opposite direction without intention and energy behind it. That's a law of thermodynamics. What I'm asking you to do is find an example where that law doesn't work. And then on top of it, show that actually that law just isn't true at all. We were just wrong about it all this time. So I'm essentially asking you, because that's what you're going to need. I'm asking you to do this because that's what you would need if you want to believe in atheism. You need to go against this established scientific law. And what's cool about this law is it extends to human nature and morality. That we have an order, we have a moral structure to our world. Where'd that come from? Just randomly over time? That's not what we see in anything else. What we see instead is that there was a moral structure, that there has been a order to things ethically, and that over time it has eroded. And many of the problems we see in the world are because things are breaking down when it comes to that moral or ethical structure. It's not that ethical or moral structure is somehow getting better over time. It's getting worse, which lines up with the second law of thermodynamics. Things were made well in the beginning. God called things good in the beginning. And now they get worse over time. That's the second law of thermodynamics. But what the atheist or what the evolutionist will tell you is that things were chaotic and then they've gotten better over time. Is that what we see in the world? If it is, show me the example. If it is, show me that that is the prevailing pattern in the world. Show me that chaos produces order regularly in the world. and that'll shake my faith. So that's your homework. Show that the second law of thermodynamics isn't true. That's what you need to do to shake my faith. Now, there are other things we could look at, but to me, that is the one I go to because it's so powerful. And so that's where we'll stop for today. I hope you'll really kind of think deeply about the design inference here. And hey, if you're up to the challenge, you know how to get in touch with me. It's again at Jerry at jerryswafford.com. Send in your homework, and we might be able to talk about some of those submissions. So the flip side of that is, if you're going to be intellectually honest here, and you realize, I can't come up with an example of that. That isn't how the world works. So that law is real. And if there's a law, maybe there is a lawgiver. Then email me about that as well. That's it for today's show. Till next time, keep asking questions, keep the faith.